Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Hood Museum of Art's winter programming for 2021. We have a wonderful lineup for you, and some of you may have already jumped right in with our virtual Storytime in the Galleries program that was offered last week for ages 2 through 5. And today we are delighted to announce the inaugural segment of a new series called Spotlight on Public Art at Dartmouth. These will be 30-minute segments exploring the many outdoor sculptures accessible to the public across the campus. Each segment will feature a brief pre-recorded introduction to the work, followed by a live conversation with a special guest. And these spotlights are being recorded and will be added to the museum's YouTube channel. We're joined today by Amelia Kahl, Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood, 1918, Curator of Academic Programming. And our special guest today is Hélène Gillette-Woodard from the Williamstown Conservation Center. And we're going to explore Thel by Beverly Pepper. We encourage you to enter questions and thoughts at any time during the program into the Q&A or the chat on your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can during the time that we have. If your device allows, you can enhance your viewing experience by clicking on the caret next to the viewing options, next to the green bar that notes that I'm sharing my screen. Just scroll down to the side-by-side option and you'll be able to view both the presentation and the speakers without overlap. And you can also zoom in on the presentation by adjusting your zoom ratio under the same caret. If you're using an iPad, you can use your fingers to pinch in and out to zoom. If you wish to hide the video of the panels and speakers while we're viewing the film, you may be able to go to the ellipsis in your Zoom toolbar and choose Hide Video Panel. Not all devices are going to have this option, but if you do have that option, that's a possibility. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to my colleague, Amelia Kahl.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. So welcome to everybody. I'm so glad you could join us this afternoon for this new outdoor sculptures series. As Sharon said, I'm the Curator of Academic Programming at the Hood Museum, and I'm joined by Hélène Gillette-Woodard, the Department Head of Objects at the Williamstown and Atlanta Art Conservation Center, located in Williamstown, Massachusetts. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being our guest today, Hélène.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The format for today, which is a little different, as Sharon was saying, we're trying a new format, is a pre-recorded introduction followed by a Q&A with Hélène. So I'll ask her some questions and then we would love to hear your questions as well. And during the Q&A, we're going to have a slideshow of images that will rotate through various views of Thel. I'd like to thank several of my colleagues for their hard work on this program. Allison Palazzolo and Christopher Warren recorded the footage that makes up the pre-recorded segment, and Allison created the video. So thank you both so much for all of that work, particularly to Allison. And major thanks always to my colleague Sharon Reed, who continually ensures that these programs run so smoothly. So on that note, Sharon, let's start with the video.
Welcome. My name is Amelia Kahl, and I'm the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming at the Hood Museum of Art. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Hood Museum of Art's new series featuring outdoor sculpture located on the Dartmouth campus in Hanover, New Hampshire. Our inaugural piece is this sculpture by Beverly Pepper titled Thel. Pepper created Thel between 1975 and 1977. It's made up of 5 steel triangular forms painted white with a total length of 135 feet. Thel is site-specific. It was made for this area between the Sherman Fairchild Physical Sciences Center and Wheeler Hall Dorm, just across the street from the east entrance of Baker Library. Set within this group of buildings, the sculpture's white enameled exterior is a response to nearby New England architecture, taking our eye from the sharp white prism forms on the ground to related features nearby. For example, look at the white trim and bell tower of Baker Library, or of the church next door, and note the roofline of the dorm nearby. White churches are common throughout New England. Thel's color also relates to the snowy New Hampshire winter. The sculpture's relationship to the environment changes with the seasons and in turn impacts how we experience it throughout the year. The white forms blend into the snow in winter, but are dramatically set off by the green grass of summer. This connection is intensified by the way Pepper planted grass on some of the panels, further integrating Thel into the landscape. Pepper recalled, quote, In the 70s, I developed the concept of earthbound sculptures, that is, sculptures seemingly born in or rising up from the earth. The use of nature within Thel is not only to project, but also to link it to process and change in man's life and society." End quote. In concert with this idea, Pepper chose the title of the sculpture from William Blake's poem, The Book of Thel, written in 1789. In the poem, Thel is the name of a virgin shepherdess concerned with her mortality. Her motto is, "Does the eagle know what is in the pit, or wilt thou go ask the mole? Can wisdom be put in a silver rod, or love in a golden bowl?" In the poem, Thel searches for meaning in her life by talking to several entities, including a lily of the valley, a cloud, a worm, and a clod of clay. These creatures represent different spheres of knowledge: the heavens, the earth's surface, and underground. The creatures are satisfied with their lives because they believe themselves to be part of the natural cycle of death and rebirth. At the end of her discoveries, Thel rejects this knowledge and flees back home to a land of innocence and eternity. The creation of the sculpture began in 1975 when a Dartmouth committee commissioned Pepper. To create the site-specific piece, Pepper visited Hanover several times during the design and installation of this monumental sculpture, presenting her ideas in February of 1976. She then constructed Thel at her studio factory in Italy, a country she had lived and worked in since the 1950s. Pepper spent much of her career working in factories and felt at home in them, an unusual position for a female artist at the time. The factories allowed her to work in industrial materials such as steel and iron. In fact, she was the first artist in America to use Corten steel, the material used in Thel, after U.S. Steel gave it to her to experiment with in 1964. These materials allowed her to create work at such a grand scale. In fact, the original plan for Thel had it at 35 feet, and when the sculpture was shipped to Dartmouth's campus as disassembled pieces, it was discovered that it exceeded that by 100 feet, for a total length of 135 feet. Thel's pieces were reassembled and placed in the landscape under Pepper's personal direction in September of 1977. As with many other examples of her work, Thel retains a movement and a lightness despite its steel construction and large size. Its white color, dramatic angularity, integration into the environment, and the dynamic spaces created in the negative space between the sculpture and the earth give it a depthness that belies the heaviness of the steel. Many have described Pepper's sculpture Thel as emerging from the earth, although some have described the opposite, seeing it as an airplane crash or another object fallen from the heavens. For many viewers, it inspires some kind of narrative. At Thel's dedication in 1977, Pepper said the sculpture, quote, "is really about as earth is to sky, about reaching and soaring and being deep-rooted," end quote. The triangular forms have precedence in her earlier work, particularly in another site-specific piece titled Dallas Canal Hillside, created between 1971 and 1975. At the Hood Museum of Art, we see it as a privilege to have Pepper's monumental work on Dartmouth's campus, especially in the wake of Pepper's passing in February of 2020. Thel was not the first sculpture in this space. Earlier, after completion of the Sherman Fairchild Physical Sciences Center, the Fairchild Foundation funded Charles Perry's bronze D2D. Thel was funded by the Fairchild Foundation Grant too, and also by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts that was meant to expose the public to contemporary sculpture. Both foundations approved of Dartmouth's choice of Pepper for the commission. Initial reactions to Thel were mixed. There were positive responses from the art community comparing it with a comet and its tail, a granite outcropping, a New England church, and an arrow viewed from above, among others. The lawn on which it sits used to be a popular student hangout referred to as the beach by residents of next-door Wheeler Dorm. Students were unhappy about losing their beach. In response to the grumbling, Beverly Pepper told students, quote, "I did not rob you of your beach. I gave you deck chairs instead." End quote. When it was installed in the 70s and in subsequent decades, Thel created an axis between Fairchild, which holds the departments of Geography and Earth Science, and Baker Library. With the addition of Berry Library in 2002, Thel is in the path of Wheeler's residents as they make their way to Berry's north entrance, asking us to think about how site-specific sculptures function as their contexts evolve.
As Pepper said, monumental sculpture exists as an experiential space. We invite you to visit Thel in person the next time you are in Hanover. to walk around it, and to think about how it relates to its natural and built environments. Thank you for joining us. We hope to explore our forthcoming segments on public sculpture.
All right. So now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the program. So I have some questions for Hélène, and then we'd love to hear your questions. So you can submit them into the Q&A or the chat boxes below. And I just want to note that this choice of Thel as our inaugural sculpture is kind of timely for a couple reasons. As you may have caught in the taped piece, Beverly Pepper passed away in 2020. So this is a nice way for us to honor her memory and her work. And also we had the chance last summer to do some conservation work on Thel. And so you'll see some pictures in the PowerPoint that's going to rotate through. And that is one of the reasons that we invited Hélène here today to talk about conservation in regards to this sculpture and outdoor sculpture more broadly. So my first question is, from a conservator's perspective, what are some concerns with an outdoor sculpture like Thel?
Well, with many outdoor sculptures, the conservator looks at Thel in a totality. Not only do we want to understand the artist's concept and original intent, but we also want to look at its materials that it was made out of and how those materials interact with the environment in which they are in. Thel was constructed from corten steel, as you mentioned, in the heading area, as well as painted with an epoxy-based paint. It was also cited specifically for this area because of the way she had wanted the design to flow within the landscape. The concerns with Thel are a combination of two things, but the main combination is that it's embedded as well as surrounded by earth, and as a result, that earth reacts with the structure of the piece, which is the corten steel and the epoxy paint. Both of these materials do not do well with constant moisture issues, so that we are monitoring it and will always be watching over that part of its preservation.
Great, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your connection with Thel?
Well, in 2010, I was asked by the Hood Museum staff to come and do a condition assessment of all of the sculptures that are part of the Dartmouth Public Art Collection, which is all the sculptures on campus. And from there, I started working with looking at all the collection, assessing their conditions, assessing what needs to be done to further preserve them, and what are the main issues of deterioration that are happening with each sculpture. So in 2010, I did an examination of Thel, and we determined that there was issues with the paint being damaged by impact damage, such as mowers, weed whackers, students riding skateboards over them. All of these elements had damaged the paint to such a degree that it revealed the underlying metal surface, and that surface was actively corroding, which meant that it was deteriorating and basically would go to the point where it could easily get holes within the structure and undermine its structural stability. So when we noted that there was a possible need for a repainting and probably repairing of some of the structure, we started monitoring it. And it was continually monitored by not only myself, but also the HUD registration staff to see when it was time. And last spring, summer, they decided it was time to have the old paint removed and the piece be repainted and repaired. And that was done, and they worked with me. I was a consultant of that piece while they were doing that restoration.
And thank you for that as well. So can you talk about, you mentioned a little bit about outdoor sculpture, how it's embedded in the ground and how that can kind of accelerate this corrosion. Are there issues that are, are the issues with Thel particular to Pepper's oeuvre overall, or are they just sort of particular to this work, or what's kind of specific to Thel in terms of the conservation issues?
Well, there's a general bit with most metal sculptures that are outdoors. Metal does go through, well, basically it wants to become a mineral again. It goes into entropy. So all metal sculptures will slowly deteriorate become mineralized and fall apart. That's general principles of physics. But with so many sculptures have to have a protective coating. They have to be maintained. They have to be annually assessed. So Thel isn't unique in that. Thel is unique in that the materials that were chosen and how those materials interact with the environment, how the environment is actually interacting with the piece itself. So in many cases, you can see that there, in one image you might have seen there's a drainage system towards the bottom end of Thel, which allows for water not to stand close to the sculpture. This prevents excessive corrosion at the foot of each of these elements. Another thing is when we mentioned that damage of the paint causing isolated areas of corrosion, to keep the paint layer intact is really a main component of the maintenance of this piece because of the underlaying metal. The choice of the metal was unique in that, yes, Corten steel was being experimented on by the 60s and 70s artists of the time. However, at the time, they didn't understand some of the physical mechanisms of Corten. Corten is also known as weathering steel or atmospheric corrosion resistant steel. And the reason it's because that is because it's alloyed with a copper chromium component. And the copper chromium component within the alloy allows the sculpture over time to develop a corrosion resistant layer. However, the one point that really wasn't understood in the 60s and 70s by the artist community was that the piece had to dry out between exposure to moisture. And only when it dried out was that corrosion resistant layer developed. So with Thel and with a number of other pieces in terms of the construction, you have an interior that's not going to dry out because it's a cubic kind of form. And you then also have the paint layer, which also prevents the surface from drying out. So in many ways, though it's made out of Corten steel, it really isn't acting like Corten steel. It is actually acting like a mild steel or a iron element, which will corrode over time. And therefore, again, we have to maintain the paint layers so that that doesn't happen.
So that's interesting that Pepper is kind of one of these early artists, one of the first artists to work in Corten steel, that it took a while before artists really understood exactly how that steel would stay consistent within the environment. Have artists continued to work with Corten steel? Do we see these conservation issues in more contemporary art, or have they evolved into different issues?
They have evolved into different issues. There are many sculptors that use Corten steel now, but many of them understand the need for an open sculpture and the need for this ability for all surfaces of the metal to dry at a given time. Of course, there's always issues with the design in which, like the corbels in Thel or in some others, where if there's corners where water will build up, or if there's just an underlaying area where the moisture is just going to be in constant contact, like right next to the ground, or with Thel when the soil is actually on top of the piece, those are all going to be areas, even in a contemporary piece now. They just have minimized them more and more understanding of what the material can do for them.
So what are your thoughts in terms of the longevity of Thel? What does the museum need to do to continue to care for it?
I think it's not only the museum, it's also the campus students as well as the grounds crew too. But I think everybody needs to be aware of the maintenance of the paint layer and also the buildup of the soil associated with it. We do know that there's an issue with, the grass isn't always as green as they would like it to be, to get that kind of green and white combined aesthetic. And there's been talk about how to improve that, but those are still up in terms of the design element, but trying to bring it back closer to the artist's intent in terms of having these really green patches on top of the sculpture. But I think mainly it's monitoring it, making sure that the damages are repaired as soon as possible, and knowing that you're always going to have maybe every 10 to 15 years repainting of the sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
But doing that, he'll keep the longevity for decades.
That's good news. That's good to hear. So I'd love to transition now and take some questions from the audience. I'm seeing a couple questions already in the chat. Sharon, do you want to lead us into those?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that are related, so I'm going to combine them into one, if I may. The question is about how is the sculpture anchored to the ground? Like, are the pieces of the sculpture supported by a foundation below grade, or do they sit right on the ground?
Yeah, they are below ground. Actually, Sharon, maybe you could advance the PowerPoint, and there's we can
That's
see
a very good picture of that.
there's construction images, and then there's also an image of a plan, of a construction plan. Oh, so you can see a little bit here. So part of the of each of the triangular forms is embedded into the earth, but there isn't sort of like a strata. This is an image of construction work. So that's kind of how they're anchored, is that they're literally buried into the ground.
Yeah.
What the second question part of that was, Sharon?
That was the question, like, is it below grade, and how is that anchored into the ground? So I think those sort of tied into one another, but we do have another question about the watering of the grass. Does that exacerbate the erosion of the Corten steel?
So long as the paint surface, so remember, it's the paint surface that's really important here. So long as it is strong and protective, the amount of water that hits it isn't going to be that much of an issue. The idea is that water can penetrate, if it stays on a surface for a long time, water can penetrate through micro fissures in the paint layer, and at those points of micro fissures, they'll then interact with the metal. Then the metal will corrode and it'll erupt through the paint. So those are the main issues. So long as the paint layer remains fairly intact and water doesn't sit on the sculpture for a long period of time, you should be okay.
Okay, great. So we have an interesting question. Have there been any controversies over this piece?
Oh yeah, people were not a fan. Well, it varied, right? And it still varies. I think anytime you have abstract sculpture, some folks are real fans of abstract sculpture. I'm thinking some of you in the audience are, since you came to this talk, and other folks are not. So there was the controversy from the students, the Wheeler dorm students, who like to have their little beach to sunbathe on, though I'm like, it's very close to the green. You can go rest on the green. And then that was what Pepper referred to as taking away their beach, but giving them deck chairs. And that was in a D article that she responded to them. You know, it's still, I don't know if it's controversial today, but you certainly hear a range of opinions about it. So some people like the modernity of it. Some people don't. Some people recognize it as art. Some people say it's an airplane crash, and I don't think that's always said as a compliment necessarily. Oh, this is the plan image too, where you can see that bits of it are meant to be underground. So I think the controversy was really kind of a generalized controversy about modern art and abstract art in public space in general, rather than any sort of specific controversy about Pepper. And I think someone was asking too about the siting of it. It really was funded in part by a grant that was used to build the Fairchild Center that's right behind it. So it really was a sculpture that was conceived as part of that whole plaza and of fitting in with that group of buildings. And so she was really trying to relate the Fairchild Physical Sciences Center to Baker Library and the White Church. And so that's what she was sort of thinking of, playing with those angular white architectural forms.
This is really a question, I think, for you, Amelia, but with Pepper's comment about the deck chairs, I've not taken away your beach, but I've given you deck chairs. Does Dartmouth have a response to that, or do they? I don't know of an official Dartmouth response, other than they just kept going. That happened after it was installed, so the piece is still installed. So I don't know if there was an official piece, official response to it. I'm just going to find the image here that shows.
Oh, of the students. That's, yeah, so that's during the installation, camping out on it. And I think Pepper initially wanted students, like expected students to like lounge on it and lay on it and have a little bit more interaction. Now there's a lot of students who maybe like step hopefully over it. I think most students step over it if they're cutting across that way to get into that, the Berry Library entrance. But it is interesting to think about your physical experience with the work of art. So this is a great one if you're able to be in Hanover, to go under that overhang, to go look at the waffle part in that image there, and to walk throughout the forms, but not on the forms.
We are, this is a spotlight program. So as I mentioned, it's shorter than most of our programs. We do have time for one more question. If anyone has anything they want to know, either from Hélène or from Amelia, feel free, please, to jump into the chat or the Q&A.
I can say that, it's interesting to see the evolution of her forms from that piece in Dallas that had those triangular forms, but that really left the steel patina, the steel outside, and not the white forms. And then later on in her career, you see her experimenting with a lot more kind of vertical forms. The relationship here between the sculpture and the ground is really a really lovely moment in Pepper's work. I see someone is asking if there's been any vandalism to the piece. I don't know that there's been, not to my knowledge, has there been any intentional vandalism. Hélène, have you heard, has anyone reported?
No, no intentional. I mean, basically, the skateboard and that sort of thing are people just not realizing just how fragile the surface is and that sort of thing. So it's more just not realizing that more than anything else. Not intentional writing or anything like that.
Right, a little sometimes with lawn care equipment and things like that.
Yeah,
you're just not.
That's just and that happens a lot with in many pieces, especially when something has soil and grass right up next to the surface. It's really difficult to prevent some of that from happening.
Looks like we have two other questions that might be fit into our last couple minutes here. Is the waffle pattern in the steel meant to emulate the mullions of a window at all? Do we know?
That's an interesting observation. I've never seen anything explicit, but I think that grid pattern very much could respond to the other geometric elements like the window mullions. I think that's very nice, actually. Very great.
That's a really nice perspective. And finally, has the use of AstroTurf been considered? I know that the upkeep of the grass, can be challenging, especially in New England.
Yes, we have discussed that. And it has been discussed with the registration department and curatorial department at the Hood. There is consideration to it. Implementation, whether it really is her aesthetic, that's one of the main considerations. It does change the idea of a growing natural environment being embedded. So, but yes, we have talked about AstroTurf as being an excellent way of preventing maybe at least the green staying true and that sort of thing. But it may be against her idea of it in nature. So there's that consideration that also has to be weighed.
And the piece changes pretty significantly. Like I can imagine the AstroTurf looking great in the summer, but then in the winter, it may
not look right.
It might feel jarring. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, I would love to thank Hélène and Amelia today for taking us on this journey with Thel. I think it was very insightful, nice to visit some of our outdoor sculpture. It's something that is accessible outdoors at a social distance. So I hope people have a chance to do that when it's possible. We do have another program coming up in the spring and the summer. We will be rolling these out over time. So I hope you join us again. Please take the survey. There's a link that will go out in a follow-up email tomorrow, and tell us what you think of the format and so forth and so on. And we hope you'll join us again. And please visit our YouTube site. You can subscribe, and then as soon as we add a new video, it should pop up in your feed and let you know there's more to see. Other than that, thank you all so much and have a wonderful afternoon.